great that the law, and I must say, while saying this, Indian copyright law is probably one of the better in the world, right? So Consumers International did surveys across more than 30 countries over 3 years, and India was each of the years within the top 10, right? But that is no great achievement because copyright law throughout the world sucks. And in the US, the great thing that they have is that the exception, fair use exception, is fantastic, right? We ought to also have that kind of an open-ended exception. In addition to the specific exceptions that we have, we need an open-ended exception as well, and we don't have that. So right now, because you are not being prosecuted, the policy is still bad, the law is still bad. So I would rejoice if someone sued you, if the government of India sued you. Okay. So I would say, not apart from that selfish reason, go right ahead, because you're not really committing what most people would see as a wrong, what the government sees as a wrong, because it's actually putting it out there and is in its tweets encouraging people to use, right? So you could claim other kinds of legal defenses as well, saying that actually the government advertised this as being open for reuse, etc., despite having this disclaimer. So there are innovative legal theories you can use to say that you're not liable. But most importantly, they want you to do it, and go right ahead. The law needs to change, not your behavior, right? Yeah. It's not something ethically wrong. There is nothing wrong in what you're doing ethically, at least. In terms of what license to use, now the one good thing dealing with the world of copyright licensing in data rather than software is that in software we have virality as well, right? So you have licenses which you have frequent situations where there's incompatibility of licenses. Now, in the world of data, largely you go for the most open licenses and often don't include virality. You generally end up encouraging commercial use as well. Given that that's what's largely followed, the situation is simpler. But what you go for, what kind of a license you go for, I would say go for a Creative Commons 4.0 license, an international license. They no longer have country-specific licenses as they used to up till version 3. And what kind of a license you go for, whether it restrict commercial use, whether it have the share alike clause, that's really up to you and up to what you want to achieve. I generally think that insofar as stuff that I make available goes, it depends. Sometimes I put it under I almost never do share alike, but I often put it under like non-commercial usage restriction. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, depending on the situation. Insofar as governments are concerned, I don't think of it as a simple answer. Folks like the Open Knowledge Foundation, they think it's simple. They believe that it should always be open to commercial use. I actually don't think it's that simple. I think that it should be a department by department decision, because for most departments, this is not a real revenue source. But for some departments, it might be, especially in places like where there's a great amount of privatization of the public sector. So in the UK, you have the postal department that's been largely privatized, which ends up meaning that they want to monetize data, that they need to raise revenue for their own survival. They can't depend on tax pounds, so they have to raise their own revenue, and they do that by selling data, right? And should they be putting that stuff out for free for commercial use, I'm not so sure. You know, I think that we also have to question, look at two sides to this. One is to say, what if we could have a situation where everyone without my permission could use it, but if they made money off it, then they had to share back some of that money with me, right? So a government department that needs to raise cash but wants to decrease the amount of bureaucracy could go for a special license of that sort, okay? Based on, so a startup doesn't really need to jump through multiple legal hoops and write emails and clear permissions to use data. But if they actually made money off it, then there would be an obligation to share back. Okay, and at that point, you know, the government license could state that you need to provide this percentage of the revenue that you're making or profit that you're making based on this data, etc. So all kinds of possibilities are there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, there is slightly related question. What about the code which is being used to generate this kind of clean, machine-readable data out of the original PDFs and messy data sets? That code is something which I also want to make it open and under very relaxed license like MIT or something like that. Then, are there any risks associated because I'm creating a channel from which government data could be generated in a more machine-readable format?
Not at all. That would be perfectly legitimate. Like as in, there are no legal considerations insofar as I'm concerned, because that same code could be used for a number of different kinds of data sets under different licenses in the future. Next month they might decide to put all of this under a very open license rather than an all rights reserved license. So the license of what your code works on doesn't matter at all. Your code can be MIT license, it could be BSD license, etc. That's absolutely fine. Any other questions?
The monetary compensation, what would be considered fair?
I'm right now there isn't. It's not even. It's a hypothetical that I mentioned, right? So it's not as though it exists on the ground, etc. I'm saying that kind of a system might be fairer than putting restrictions on rather than requiring permission, say.
Because based on your tweet yesterday about all the foreign companies saying that UID is a good thing, I'm just wondering if there's money-making proposition that the government can win.
That I am afraid is an entirely separate discussion, okay. and so we'll save that for after the session. Is that okay? So a few other things.
One final question, ma'am. It's a small question.
Sure.
So going by that website data.gov.in, as you said, bottom of the website very clearly states that all rights reserved. Yeah. Is there a way to find out which of these information, apart from the theory,
which of these, sorry,
information or the data is copyrighted and the other ones are not, apart from the theory that you mentioned, how to
I would suggest treat all of it as open. Treat all of it as being available for reuse.
Currently there is no way to find out from this website, right?
No, because the license says all rights reserved. But what I'm suggesting is don't go by that license. Data.gov.in, the Twitter feed, and officials behind this encourage you to use this data. They want to see you use this data. Otherwise, what is Digital India about? What is Startup India about, right? They want to see greater partnerships of the sort between the private sector and the public sector. So please use this data, don't go by this. This is just a formal impediment. Treat it as though it doesn't exist, because it shouldn't really exist. Folks have been trying to actually get this changed, and inshallah in the not too distant future that'll happen. So let's see. A few other things that we'd spoken about in that report that I had mentioned, apart from the thorny issue of copyright, which unfortunately took up so much time, The rest is simpler stuff that all of you inherently understand, and I don't really need to tell you about it. Standards and interoperability, for instance, right? We're right now in a situation where we very often don't even have basic technological interoperability. Lots of data isn't even digital. We then need to get to a situation where we have some amount of tech and I guess format and syntax interoperability, if you think of it that way. And it's still going to take a lot of time before we get to semantic interoperability, before we get to a situation where we look at a column titled something in one document and some other document with the same title, and we're wondering whether they're both referring to the same data fact or not, because very often they aren't. And when we're talking, say, more like almost 70 years since independence, we still haven't managed to close the gap between revenue borders and administrative borders, right? So even very basic things like that, we still haven't actually reconciled. So getting semantic interoperability is going to be a really difficult task. Getting machines to actually be able to understand and do that comparisons between different documents and figure out what's right, what's wrong, and this becomes really important with budgets, right? When they say they're spending money on something, how do you know whether it's the same something that they spoke about the previous year? How do you know whether it's the same something that a different state is talking about? It's very difficult. And very often the data that they put out there doesn't include an asterisk that actually explains what this head of this budgetary head means. Okay, so it's a nightmare. It's a veritable nightmare. But fixing all of that is going to take a whole lot of time. But that's where we really need to end up there with properly structured, semantically marked up data. But and one other thing as a side on this, a few things to keep it in mind. There does exist a national open standards policy, which I would say is actually one of the best open standards policies anywhere in the world. Right? It actually requires royalty-free standards be used by the Indian government, and that there be and provides for very restricted sets of exceptions. So it's one of the most progressive policies of this sort anywhere in the world, more progressive than the EU policy, which was often held up as the gold standard in the past. I would say the Indian policy is far better. Needless to say, pretty much no one follows it, right? So one excellent, very useful bit of research would be for someone to help us determine to what extent the National Open Standards Policy is actually within any one department being followed or not followed. Now, open standards, as all of you are aware, is very important from the government perspective for a number of reasons, one of which is to prevent vendor lock-in, right? But to allow for citizens to actually engage with the government by reading and analyzing and commenting on what it produces is an equally important reason for open standards. And we have the open standards policy. We have something called the IFEC, the interoperability framework for e-governance as well, which is 3 lists of standards in different sectors that the government should be using. So not only did they put out a policy saying use open standards, they also did a detailed exercise of saying, okay, for documentary data, ODT is the standard to be followed. For mapping data, this is the standard to be followed. And for different fields and for different sectors of use, the different kinds of standards to be followed have been laid out as well. Right? And almost all of it, with a few, very, very few exceptions, are good open standards. Right? And so we should hold the government to account for this. Unfortunately, because it's still a policy, because it's not a law, there was an attempt to make this into a law as well. There was a section included in, if some of you remember, there was a bill proposed a few years ago called the Electronic Delivery of Services Bill, which died a death in the Parliamentary Standing Committee. Well, that bill contained one provision which actually gave statutory backing to these kinds of policies. Unfortunately, that bill was killed, and so now these remain policies which you can't force the government to actually follow policies. That's the difference. You can force the government to follow laws, but not policies. Policies are declarations of intention. What it would be nice if the government followed, but they can't be forced to follow them. So we want machine readability. One thing we often forget about that we also get with machine readability is accessibility. Right? Accessibility for persons with disabilities is an area that we at Center for Internet and Society work on, that you automatically get if data is machine readable. So blind people use screen readers. Now, those screen readers can't read PDFs. Okay, or let me put it differently, can't read scanned PDFs without the OCR information any better than scripts that you write can, right? But if the scripts that you write can read that data, then you can make the screen reader also read it, right? You can also make something like a search engine also read it. So if something is searchable, something is machine readable, then automatically making it accessible is that much easier. And let's all remember that we're only temporarily able to. All of us will have failing organs, will have failing senses as we grow older. You can't escape it, right? So it's just about when we hit that threshold in life, and that's better. All of us are temporarily able, and the same technologies that help, say, blind people also help people who are illiterate. Right? Text-to-speech engines are great for persons who are illiterate as well. Similarly for elderly people. Right? The same kinds of technologies that are useful for accessibility are useful all around. And machine readability is something that helps move towards that. In this crowd, I guess I don't have to say this, but we recommended that the government, insofar as possible, use free and open source software and make all of the software that it uses to do things like cleaning up this data, etc. Make all of that also free software. Now, of course, that hasn't happened, but at least there's a national open source policy now, which similarly requires that central government actually use open source software for whenever it's putting out a procurement tender. It's not being followed. Someone to help us with the research to show that it's not being followed and to shame the government would be very welcome as well.
Pranesh, sorry for interrupting.
Sure.
Just a quick time check. We have 5 minutes to go. We need more time than that.
5 minutes would be great. I'll just wrap up now.
Thank you.
Okay, so 3 other things I very quickly wanted to cover. One, which I can cover in one line, security. Right? It's crucial when it comes to data-driven things that we're seeing coming out from the government, like smart cities, etc., which a number of us are excited about, but are also fearful of, because they're, As some of you might have been reading in the news, India's been having a real problem in terms of cyber espionage over the past few years. Some of you might have read about the Suckfly incident. Apart from that, Kaspersky's reported an independent malware that's targeted the Indian government. That's siphoned off a lot of data. So that's something to be really concerned about as well in terms of data. Right? Who has access to what data, and how much of that data is privileged data, is data that shouldn't be out there. Now I come to the last two bits, which I'll wrap up in 5 minutes, where I wanted to get to the issue of ethics and power as well. I believe that there is an inherent trade-off between the utility that you can get out of data sets and the potential of that data set to infringe upon someone's privacy. I see this as an unavoidable, inherent trade-off. Now we can discuss what we mean by utility, what we mean by privacy, etc. But I see this as something that's inescapable. The more granular, the more detailed information that you have, the better it is, right, at making predictions, at conducting analysis, etc. But the more granular, the more detailed information that you have that can be linked to anyone, the more potential there is of misuse of that data as well. Okay, so just as potential for use increases, the potential for misuse increases. And that's an inescapable thing. So when we're talking about the government putting out data, or even when we're talking about the private sector, folks like us putting out cleaned up data, we have to ask the question of what are the privacy implications of what we're doing, right? While at the same time asking, you have to see how useful is this data if I don't include this amount of granularity. If I do it at an abstraction, it might not actually be useful at all, right? But at what level can I put out data so that it doesn't become a privacy risk? Now, in the future, and this is not an escape. This is not a problem with a simple solution, right? We're going to have in the future self-driving cars. These cars will be tracking our movements. These cars might even be making decisions for us, such as whether to allow us to turn on the ignition or not if you're drunk, say. All of this would improve safety, right? But all of this would also include tracking, which might reveal a lot about what all we are doing, which we might not want to reveal to the rest of the world. Surveillance cameras might be great in some ways. Again, potential for misuse is also great. License plate readers, same thing. Smart meters for electricity, etc., same issue. Someone can find out from a distance whether you're at home or not based on your smart meter, if it's not secure, see. 2 points here. One, we have to remember that all of these, when any kind of prediction analysis outcomes are made, they're made on the basis not of what you are, but on the basis of your data doppelganger. Right? You create this data trail. You create all these data records through your smart meters, you create them through all the transactions you've done on your credit cards, you create them in all these different kinds of ways. And decisions are being made on the basis of those, not on the basis of you. And the problem there is that that data is devoid of context, is devoid of things that we take to be important, such as intent. If a traffic camera sends you a ticket just on the basis of you having sped through a traffic light, that doesn't include within its logic questions of whether you are an ambulance driver. It doesn't include within its logic whether you were trying to, say, go to the hospital with someone in the back seat. doesn't include all of that. Intent, context, etc. are absent from a number of these kinds of decisions, right? Which is why we really need to be concerned about questions of privacy and the way data analytics, etc. Really affects it. And one other note, there is no such thing as anonymous data if you have enough data sets. If there are multiple overlapping data sets, so far we have not found a way of actually anonymizing data. Those who are working on de-anonymizing data sets have always been a step ahead, unfortunately, right? And so far, it's just not succeeded. So there's one potential solution that's off the table, right? There is no such thing as an anonymized data set. The last thing, if I may have 2 more minutes, is that I want to cover is the issue of discrimination. I don't know how many of you saw this ProPublica story a couple of days ago on how this software created by a private firm for help in sentencing, right, is deeply biased in terms of race. So this software, which is being touted and being used by multiple states in the US, and is being touted as being able to predict whether, or not predict, sorry, give a risk score for whether this person whom you're sentencing as a judge is likely to be a recidivist, is likely to go back to committing a crime. And a large investigation by ProPublica actually shows that the software has done a terrible job. Okay, and the kinds of metrics that it uses have actually ended up being greatly biased against black people. And they have fascinating account of things like 2 people being arrested for very different things. A white guy for a much more violent crime with a history of violence, who actually did commit violence again, versus a first-time black offender who didn't have any such history of violence and yet got a harsher sentence, right? Because of the software actually assigning very different risk scores. So whenever we are thinking about whenever we are thinking about data analytics, we have to think about inherent biases, latent biases. And they are latent because we aren't thinking about them, right? Apps, for instance, that measure bumps on a road to see where potholes are might seem innovative, but if the municipality decides to assign priority to those, that might actually end up being discriminatory rather than, those places where there are no roads which need attention, or those places where people who don't have smartphones and don't have this app, etc. Rather than focusing on those, suddenly the problems of the already privileged get accorded a greater priority. And if you just dig beneath the surface, there are hundreds of examples like this, right? What happens when you actually end up mapping a slum? Whom does it privilege? Does it end up benefiting the builders more, or does it end up benefiting the slum dwellers more? Right? As an NGO, what are your responsibilities? Now, this is not to say that the answer always comes out, because the answer is very likely to be, always the privileged are going to benefit more. But I actually don't agree with that. So in the instance of slum dwellers, well, I know of a case where reluctance, because a particular project took a lot of time to actually do mapping of a particular slum, the private builders, they commissioned people to actually do that mapping. And that team did in less than a week what it took the NGO folks with far fewer people and